Good day. Today is the 8th of September, so we are now well into the fourth month of Kiev's counteroffensive. And can I just say that it is now 4 months since Ukraine began its efforts to capture Rabotino. And there's again been relatively scant news about the situation on the battlefronts. It's not entirely easy sometimes to get a comprehensive idea of what is going on, but my overall impression is that the Ukrainian offensive is now indeed ebbing and may be in its last weeks. Some months ago, I said that I thought that the limiting factor would probably be artillery shells, 155mm artillery shells. I made a very crude rule of thumb calculation. I said that on the assumption that Ukraine would be firing around 10,000 shells a day to keep its offensive going, and on the assumption that it had received around 1 million of these shells from the United States and its various allies, including perhaps South Korea, well, I thought that an offensive would probably last for around 3 months and might start to peter out at the end of August. Well, a number of things then happened. Some weeks ago, the United States, the president himself, Joe Biden, admitted that the United States was largely out of 155mm shells and that it had to supply Ukraine with cluster munitions instead, cluster munitions in substitution for those unitary 155mm shells. And that perhaps has stretched the timeline somewhat. It seems the general consensus is that these cluster munitions are not as effective or as useful on this sort of battlefield as the unitary 155mm shells are, but the supplement of the cluster munitions plus dribs and drabs of 155mm shell deliveries from the United States and Europe do seem to have stretched somewhat the amount of time that Ukraine can continue the offensive. And I was very interested to watch some days ago an absolutely fascinating program on the new Atlas, Brian Beletic's show on YouTube. Absolutely indispensable program if you want to follow the course of the fighting. And I noticed that over the course of it, his guest, Scott of Calibrated, who is somebody who, as Brian Beletic says, devotes a huge amount of his time on the trenches of this war, not of the war itself, of course, but on the trenches of the information war in the various Telegram channels, Russian and Ukrainian, and going through the various Twitter feeds and threads. Anyway, Scott of Calibrated, I noticed, put the firing rate of Ukrainian artillery at 1,000 to 2,000 shells a day, sharply below the 10,000 that I'd guesstimated would be needed in order to sustain the offensive effectively. And by the way, he said that Russian artillery firings, by the time that the program was made on the 1st of September, had also fallen to 6,000 to 10,000 rounds a day, which of course is still multiples greater than what Ukraine is apparently firing. But anyway, 1,000 to 2,000 rounds a day, allegedly, is what Ukraine is firing. Some part of that will be cluster munitions, but it does seem to be an inadequate number of shells fired in order to sustain an offensive over an 800-kilometer front, or indeed to maintain defence right across this entire front. So that might be another factor in perhaps causing the offensive to start to slow down. Anyway, the fact is the offensive still continues, at least in some forms. General Tarnavsky, a few days ago, in the interview he gave to The Guardian, Ukrainian General Tarnavsky, he actually did say that Ukraine has had to concentrate its efforts in a small number of sectors now. It can't any longer conduct a general offensive across the entire front line, as it was apparently trying to do earlier, and that it's focusing its efforts in a few sectors. An interesting admission, which hasn't been widely picked up, by the way, but that would perhaps also indicate a running down of resources with which to conduct the offensive, and a consequent focus, therefore, on a few small areas of the battlefronts. Now, there have been other guesstimates about the length of time that Ukraine can sustain this offensive. Someone on Slavyangrad, I think it might have been Gleb Bazov, he suggested that it would start to run down and perhaps end in the second half of September. Well, today's the 8th of September, so that is not so far away. And yesterday, I saw reports appearing in various places, which, by the way, I couldn't trace, though they're alleged to come from an article in The Economist, though I've checked in The Economist, and if so, I haven't been able to find the reference. But anyway, there's supposed to be a report that the United States itself now believes that Ukraine can only continue the offensive for a further 6 to 7 weeks at most. So that would take us to the middle of October, which is coincidentally, of course, the time when the rains begin and the mud season starts. Now, I don't know whether and to what extent this is correct. As I said, this is all guesswork by me, by Slavyangrad, perhaps by the officials in the United States. But for what it is worth, for the moment, it does seem as if Ukraine's efforts to continue its offensive are proving, well, a lot less intense than had been the case previously. Now, before I go into the weeds and discuss a little of what is going on, though I don't intend this time to spend a huge amount of time over it, I will just make one further point of information, which is that Yevgeny Belitsky, the acting head of the Zaporozhye regional government, I should stress the Russian-appointed Zaporozhye regional government. Anyway, he now says that the Russians have destroyed 2 Challenger tanks. And this is the TASS dispatch. He says that Russian forces have destroyed 2 British-made Challenger tanks in the Zaporozhye region with Kornet anti-tank missile systems. 2 rolled out. The Kornet was used against them. In principle, the very first hit caused 1 to catch fire. In terms of armour, they have no special features. The Kornets cope with them easily. Our guys hit 2 tanks. Anyway, that's what TASS reports him as having said. And he says that there's another 4 Challenger tanks now based in a village called Stepnogorsk, and that there's 2 more in the town of Orekhov itself. So 2 down, another 6 in the area. This would make 8 out of the 14 which Britain originally delivered. Now, of course, there's no way of corroborating what Belitsky says. There's no pictures so far of this other knockdown Challenger 2 tank that he's talking about. But I would say that there's been quite widespread reports that the Challenger 2, the first Challenger 2, the one which was indisputably knocked out, was indeed knocked out by a Kornet anti-tank missile. Now, the Kornet is Russia's most powerful anti-tank missile, I should say infantry-based anti-tank missile. Russian tanks themselves can also fire anti-tank missiles and do so through their main tank guns, but that's an entirely different technology. The Kornet is the Russian equivalent, if you like, or at least tactical equivalent of such systems as the American Javelin and the American TOW missile system. They are carried into battle by Russian troops, Russian infantry, though they can also be used in the way that the TOW missile is also used by the United States on infantry fighting vehicles. Anyway, that, by the way, begs some rather interesting questions because, of course, the first Challenger 2 tank, the one that has indisputably been destroyed, the one that the British themselves acknowledge has been destroyed. Grant Shapps, the British Defence Secretary, says that one British Challenger 2 tank has been destroyed. Anyway, that particular Challenger 2 was located in the area of Rabotino, the village which Ukraine claimed to have captured, well, I think it was around 10 days ago. Now, if this Challenger 2 was indeed destroyed by a Kornet missile, then that means that Russian anti-tank infantry teams are still operating around Rabotino, or at any rate were operating around Rabotino a few days ago when the Challenger 2 was destroyed, and after the time when the Ukrainians claimed that Rabotino had been captured by Ukraine, and that, of course, would provide further evidence that Rabotino itself continues to be contested. Now, why am I saying all of this? I mean, apart from the interesting fact that it does seem as if Russian anti-tank missiles, anti-tank guided missiles like the Kornet can indeed destroy the Challenger. Well, I say it because I read this rather interesting piece in the Daily Telegraph. It features a long reprint of a discussion that a US Defense Intelligence Agency analyst gave to The Economist a few days ago, in which this particular analyst, and Mr. Moore, actually says that there's a realistic possibility that Ukraine might be able to break through all of Russia's defense lines on the Zaporozhye front. And the Daily Telegraph explains to us that a realistic possibility is a 40 to 50% likelihood, which doesn't seem to me particularly strong. And besides, of course, we're told that Mr. Maul thinks that that might happen. There's a 40 to 50% likelihood of that happening by the end of the year, which, of course, is weeks away, and which, of course, assumes a Ukrainian offensive still continuing for weeks through the rain, the autumn, muds, all of those sort of things, and despite the losses and the equipment shortages and all of those things. But anyway, buried inside this article about Mr. Maul and his analyses, which one should take seriously, there is this really rather interesting paragraph. Russian sources said Moscow's occupational forces were launching counterattacks at Rabotino, a nearby village recently liberated by Kiev, in an attempt to create an allure. The settlement is still being contested. So I am assuming that what the Daily Telegraph is saying is that all of these reports that we're getting from multiple sources, Russian sources, about continued fighting in and around Rabotino, reports that I've covered extensively in previous programs. Well, I presume what the Daily Telegraph is trying to say is that these reports are imaginary. They've made up all the reports of this fighting up. As I said, they are reports that come from Russian sources with connections among soldiers on the battlefronts. They proved reliable in the past. They're often critical of the Kremlin, but it seems that these are fictional reports which are intended to create an allure, presumably an impression, that Rabotino is still being fought over, and that Rabotino is not being fought over, but is in fact firmly controlled by Ukraine. That is what this paragraph says. Well, I beg to disagree. I think this is clearly wrong. I think it's not just the case that the reports about the fighting in and around Rabotino are too detailed and circumstantial and too consistent amongst too many sources to be simply invented in the way that the Daily Telegraph says. But as I've said many times, not only are the people who provide these sources often, well, largely reliable, but they are often at odds with the Kremlin and with the Russian Defense Ministry. And I find it very difficult to believe that they would invent stories like this and go on doing so for days and weeks on end in order to pretend that Rabotino is contested when in fact it is not. But anyway, going beyond that, the fact that a Challenger 2 tank has also apparently been knocked out by a Russian anti-tank team operating a Kornet missile near Rabotino, to my mind, that provides further strong evidence, proof, some would say, that despite this claim in the Telegraph, Rabotino is indeed contested. To my mind, this paragraph, by the way, what it tells us is that there are some people in Britain, in the media, who are now starting to have doubts about the claims of Ukrainian advances over the last few weeks, about Rabotino being fully captured by Ukraine, about Ukrainian breakthroughs through the Surovikin line. And this paragraph is an attempt to still those doubts by telling us, well, don't believe all these reports you're getting about fighting in this village. They're all made up by the Russians. Anyway, I've just mentioned all of this because that's, it seems to me, an interesting piece of news management here, or at least coping, as some would say. And besides, the story about the Challenger 2, which I accept, by the way, is still open to some question. Anyway, the story of the Challenger 2, the destroyed Challenger 2, appears, at least to some extent, to refute it. Anyway, what else has been going on? Well, yesterday there was, in fact, more fighting around Rabotino and Verbovoye, according to Russian sources, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense. There was even a report in Redovka, this is the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, that Russian counterattacks in Rabotino have driven Ukrainian troops entirely out of this village, and that Rabotino now is entirely in the grey zone, that no side controls any part of it. I think that is probably overstating the facts. There is an accumulation of reports that there are Ukrainian troops in the northern parts of the village at least, and that the southern part of the village is in the grey zone. But anyway, the long and the short of it is that there was fighting in Rabotino yesterday. It seems as if Rabotino remains contested. It seems that there's been no Ukrainian breakthrough in Rabotino or indeed in any other place. And the same seems to be true of Verbovoye as well. No breakthrough by Ukraine there either. All of these places remain contested. Ukraine still continues to fight for these villages in the control zone north of the Surovikin line, claims that the Surovikin line has been breached, claims that Ukraine is moving on to the second line are clearly, for the moment, wrong. Certainly that's how it looks to me, and all of the reports that I'm seeing from the battlefronts, which I judge reliable, all of them largely confirm that. So, nothing much going on there. Some reports that the Russians have made some advances in this town of Marinka, near Donetsk, that the fight for Marinka is finally coming to an end. As I've said, this has been a town which the Russians claimed that they'd captured about a year ago and haven't in fact captured, and this has been a prolonged and, I think for the Russians, somewhat embarrassing episode. But anyway, there's some reports that the Russians are now finally in the process of clearing Marinka, and also reports that Ukraine has essentially stopped attacks on the Vremivka salient, that they might be, in fact be in the process of redeploying troops from the Vremivka salient to the Zaporozhye front lines, perhaps to try and renew attacks towards Rabotino and Verbovoye, who's to say, and dribbles of reports about continued Russian advances on the Oskol River line and further north towards the town of Kupiansk. And can I say in terms of that offensive or mini offensive that the Russians are conducting on the northern front lines, Vladimir Putin promoted some of his generals yesterday, and I noticed that one of the generals who has been promoted is General Medvedev, who is commander of the forces south of Kupiansk, who have been pushing towards the Oskol River. He's been promoted to Colonel General, which is a rank just below the rank of full general. And clearly, Putin, at least for the moment, and one must assume the Defense Ministry as well, are pleased with him. But anyway, that's all I can say about the situation on the battle lines. It does seem to me that time, one way or another, is now running short, and that certainly it's looking increasingly unlikely that there's going to be any major Ukrainian breakthrough this month or next month. There's an accumulation of reports that Ukraine has run through a lot of its manpower, that it's struggling to make up the numbers in its soldiers, that it's no longer able to recruit numbers of men in the quantities that it needs to keep its forces up to strength, that it's considering a further mass mobilization in the autumn and winter, and of course that Ukraine's offensive generally is running down, and as I said, that a breakthrough for the moment looks unlikely. There are, by the way, some claims. I saw yet another claim that there are rumors that in Ukraine they're now talking about reaching Tokmak, important town on the way to Melitopol, by the thaw. Now, the thaw is, of course, in spring. It's in April, to be precise. If Ukraine really expects, if there are really reports that Ukrainian commanders and officials are talking about reaching Tokmak by April, then I think we can truthfully say that this offensive is now indeed winding down. And going back to that program on the new atlas with which I was talking about with Scott of Calibrated and others. Scott of Calibrated was saying that when the offensive finally ends and when it's become clear that none of its objectives have been achieved, which will be in a few weeks' time, well, at that point, it will be difficult to continue to preserve the optimism about the war. Recriminations in the West will begin. Arguments about the way forward will break out in earnest, and we will see more talk about what the West, about what the United States in particular should do. And I think about that, he might be right. Anyway, before I finish with this brief summary, or rather not so brief summary, but this summary of what's happening, there were more Russian drone attacks on Ukraine yesterday, very heavy drone attacks, again in the Black Sea area, around Ukraine's Black Sea ports. There were some claims that Izmail, Nikolaev and Odessa, the three key centers, were subjected to the most intense drone attack that Russia has launched since the start of the special military operation. I'm not really able to provide much in the way of information about it. There's been claims of heavy damage. There's been one film of a Uranium-2 drone being shot down by Ukrainian anti-aircraft guns. It's quite a dramatic picture, but it does seem that the drone attack did cause a significant amount of damage. But as I said, I'm not going to try and assess it. It's not something I'm really able to do. So, there we are. That's, it seems to me, the situation in the war overall. I've noticed that Ukraine's drone offensive, its own drone offensive against Russia, seems to be running down as well. And by the way, and for the record, given that these are relatively small drones that Ukraine is using, smaller, as far as I can judge, than the Uranium-2 drones, I wonder whether, as the weather conditions turn more difficult, whether these Ukrainian drones, which have been launched against targets in Moscow and across Western Russia, whether that drone offensive can be maintained in the autumn and winter conditions at the same level of intensity as we've seen over the course of the summer. Well, I don't know. I'm not an expert in these matters, so I'm not really able to say. But anyway, more Russian drone attacks, fewer Ukrainian drone attacks, and essentially stasis, a state of barely any movement on the front lines, Ukraine continuing to launch attacks, Ukraine continuing to suffer casualties, Ukraine perhaps losing more of its precious supply of tanks, Ukraine running out of ammunition and perhaps having to husband ammunition, and an offensive, a general sense, at least in a sense that I'm getting, that the offensive itself is now running down. If I am right about that, and if in a few weeks' time the Ukrainian offensive, which will have been fought for 4 months, has visibly come to a stop, and we are in a situation where there's arguments and discussions in the West about what to do next and about whether to negotiate with the Russians or not. Anyway, if that is all right, then I'm going to suggest that at that point, the focus will switch, the attention will move on the battlefronts, not to what Ukraine is doing, which is what we've been talking about for the last 4 months or so, 3 months ago or so, but what the Russians are going to do, whether they are indeed going to launch an autumn-winter offensive, as several Russian officials, Belitsky, Alaudinov, and others, have sort of hinted at. And I think that before I discuss that, and little I can really add, because of course I'm not familiar with Russian thinking or Russian planning, there is one particular myth, or at least comment that people make about the Russian autumn-winter offensive, which I think I would like to respond to in this program now, which is that several people make the point that last year, after Ukraine's offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson region, there were again lots of rumors that the Russians were going to launch an offensive in the winter, and allegedly or supposedly no such Russian offensive was in fact launched during the winter. The front lines remained stable, and no such offensive, no such Russian winter offensive took place. Well, I'm going to push back on that. It seems to me that there was actually a Russian winter offensive, and it was quite a substantial one. And of course, it was a successful one. And the Russian winter offensive was the one which was launched in November, with the Wagner organization acting as the spearhead, and which at the end of May resulted in the capture of the town of Bakhmut, a town of around 70,000 people before the war, and of all the associated villages and suburbs all around it. And this was, in military terms, a very large and significant affair indeed. I remember over the course of the autumn and winter and then the early spring doing many programs about the fighting in Bakhmut, about the severity of Ukrainian losses defending Bakhmut. I remember there were all sorts of programs and articles that appeared in all kinds of places which identified the huge numbers of Ukrainian troops and formations, brigades and such things that were concentrated in and around Bakhmut, trying to defend this town which the Russians were attacking. And of course, the thing is, this offensive was successful. Not only was Bakhmut captured by the Russians, but more importantly, Ukraine suffered exceptionally high losses trying to defend it. Losses that were confirmed in many articles that appeared even in the Ukrainian media and in the Western media as well. Ukraine lost tens of thousands of men defending Bakhmut in the face of this Russian offensive, which ended up capturing it. The Russians, of course, did not launch a general offensive across the entire front lines last winter, as some had thought they might do, as I, for a time, thought that they might do. But it's a mistake, it's a serious mistake, to say that there was no Russian offensive last winter at all. There was. It was perhaps the most intense fighting. It resulted in perhaps the most intense fighting that there has been this century on any battlefront. And of course, it was the Russians who won it. And the Ukrainian army was severely weakened. Ukraine suffered very heavy losses over the course of the Battle of Bakhmut, the offensive that resulted in the capture of Bakhmut. And of course, in the meantime, the Russians were not idle. They continued to build up their forces, and they created the Surovikin line. So I think that this suggestion that there was no Russian offensive last winter, or that if there was, it was unsuccessful, which is the story promoted at the time by the British Ministry of Defence, well, to me, it seems demonstrably, almost comically wrong in light of what we actually know happened. And I find it odd that people still come up and say from time to time that there was no Russian offensive last winter, when there obviously was. Anyway, just saying, I don't want to spend more time on that. That was last winter. What the Russians intend to do this winter, I am not sure. It does seem to me that they have far more powerful forces assembled and assembling than they did last winter. It also seems to me that the Ukrainians are significantly weaker now than they were last winter. That presumably is why Ukraine is now considering another big mobilization. So, presumably, taking advantage of that fact, the Russians will do something this winter which will be on a bigger scale than what they did last winter in the offensive, which ended with the fall of Bakhmut. What I think is likely to be the case is that, rather like the offensive last winter, the primary purpose of this next Russian offensive will also be not so much to capture territory as to grind the Ukrainians, to continue to grind the Ukrainians down, to continue to wear the Ukrainians down, and to continue to wage this relentless war of attrition on Ukraine that Russia has been effectively waging since the summer of last year, and to devastating effect. And eventually, presumably, the Russians will have some bigger objectives, some larger plan, which that they can then put into effect once the attrition has taken its course. But what that's going to be, I'm not going to speculate about or discuss further on this program. In the meantime, to repeat a point made by the British historian Jeff Roberts, there is now probably, after the Ukrainian offensive ends, probably going to be some space and time for negotiations to take place. And I discussed yesterday in my program on this channel and in a parallel program that we did on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I, the possibility that the United States, the very serious, very real possibility that the United States might now move forward with its attempt to freeze the conflict, to get the Russians to agree to end the conflict on the basis of a ceasefire with no real political end point to the war, but a ceasefire on Korean lines, an armistice, if you like. Well, I have to say that that does seem to me where the United States is most likely going to go over the next few weeks and months. And I discussed in many programs that I've made recently why I don't think that will fly with the Russians. But of course, already we're starting to see significant pushback from various people in the West who don't want to see a negotiation like that take place either. And today, for example, there is an article in the Financial Times by Andreas Umland, who is a Swedish commentator and scholar and academic and writer on international affairs. Anyway, he says that any negotiations, and of course he's talking about negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, though I want to make it clear that the negotiations would actually be between Russia and the United States. It's most unlikely that Ukraine would be granted any real role in those negotiations. But he says that any such negotiations would be a moral defeat, but a moral defeat for the West. And he comes up again with all of the arguments of principle and values that we often see coming from Western commentators, that negotiations with the Russians, which allow the Russians to remain in control of territory which the West recognizes as Ukrainian, that negotiations on that basis would reward aggression, that doing that would undermine the entire rules-based international order. It would make small countries, and he doesn't specify which small countries, but to my mind it's fairly clear that he means small countries in Europe. It would make them apprehensive about their long-term position. And he says that it would be a major mistake for the West to countenance negotiations in that form, and that the only viable and proper policy is to continue to support Ukraine until it achieves victory. A victory which, by the way, he does not fully define, and which, of course, he doesn't explain how he expects this victory that he's talking about to be achieved. As is so often the case with articles of this sort, articles that talk purely about values and principles and such things, rules and all the rest, he wills the end, which is victory over Russia, but he provides no explanation as to what the means for achieving that victory are going to be. He doesn't explain how the West is supposed to find more tanks, guns, ships, planes, shells, what the West would have to do to achieve that victory that he's talking about, and what the risks involved in trying to achieve that victory against a nuclear superpower would be. None of that, of course, comes up in Andreas Umland's discussion. But I would say that actually, if you drill deeply into that article, if you take it apart and think carefully about what he is saying, and it bears remembering that, of course, he is Swedish and he writes as someone from Sweden, you can see that what he's really concerned about is not about the undermining of the international security system, the global security system. He's really worried about the situation in Europe. What he's basically telling American advocates of discussions with the Russians, negotiations with the Russians, negotiations which implicitly cede territory in Ukraine to the Russians. What he's telling them is this: if you go down this route, then we in Europe, small countries like us, are going to start to worry that we don't have the full guarantee of your protection if we run into problems with the Russians. And in light of that, we might be obliged to rethink our alliance with you and start to talk to the other side, to the Russians, in order to secure our own future, our own security. And that, it seems to me, the underlying point that Umland is making. And of course, it is a valid one. It is absolutely correct that anything other than a clear-cut victory, however that is defined by the United States and the West in Ukraine, is in some form or other going to shake the authority of the United States, the authority of the NATO system in Europe. But to my mind, this is now a stale argument, because we're long past the point where that is reversible. If people like Umland were really concerned about the future stability of the existing Euro-Atlantic system in Europe, about the US guarantee to Europe, then they should never have put it to the test that they have by permitting a war in Ukraine to happen. He skirts over the entire story of the origins of the war. He doesn't discuss the Minsk agreement. He doesn't discuss the painstaking negotiations that took place over 8 years and which led nowhere. He doesn't talk about the discussions that took place last year in Istanbul. But of course, the right thing to do is to go back, think about those negotiations, and ask whether perhaps the Euro-Atlantic system, the entire security situation in Europe, might ultimately have been better served if the United States and the European states had supported the Minsk agreement and insisted with Ukraine upon its full implementation. Anyway, that's the position that those people are in. They missed their opportunity to stabilize the situation peacefully through the Minsk agreement and to prevent the direct challenge to the Euro-Atlantic system that is now developing. But of course, that doesn't prevent them from denying that they had any role in starting the war, but nonetheless fearing the consequences if the war takes its existing course. And anyway, that is Umland, but of course there are other people as well who are now talking passionately against negotiations, any sort of negotiations. And today, in The Guardian, there is a long article by Alexei Reznikov, Ukraine's now sacked defense minister, who has been appointed, or who's going to be appointed, ambassador to London, despite all the allegations of corruption that swirl around the defense ministry, the Ukrainian defense ministry, whilst he was in charge. But anyway, he also has written an article in which he basically rejects any idea of negotiations. He says that freezing the conflict is a bad idea. He says that talking to the Russians is to reward aggression. He says that the Russians are not interested in negotiations. They're interested in the total annihilation, the complete destruction of Ukraine, that the only way to confront this is by fighting the Russians, continuing the war to the bitter end, that the only acceptable outcome is victory over the Russians, a victory which, again, Reznikov doesn't really define. He doesn't explain what victory exactly means, though obviously it does mean the return of all Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, to Ukraine, at least territory that Ukraine claims for itself. But anyway, he wants that. He does appear to want an awful lot more. But again, what he doesn't really do is explain the means with which this is to be accomplished. Of course, we've had the offensive, the Ukrainian offensive. He doesn't say very much about that either. By the way, he doesn't explain why this offensive, which has been going on now for 3 months and which is now well into its 4th month and which hasn't succeeded, he doesn't explain why any future offensive will succeed. He does talk again about wonder weapons, more weapons from the West and from the United States. He doesn't make clear why or how he expects these additional supplies of more weapons to change the situation when all the previous supplies of other weapons have clearly failed to do so. But I'm going to make a prediction that it might be the case that some people in the administration do want a negotiation. As I've said already, for them, the priority is to freeze the war, because for them the priority is not what happens in Ukraine, but the election, the coming election in the United States. That's what they're concerned about. And it may be that there are people like that. In fact, I'm confident that there are. The very fact that articles like those of Mr. Umland and Mr. Reznikov are appearing at all is a clear sign that calls for negotiations in the corridors in Washington are growing. Anyway, the fact remains that there is the other view, which, when you really unpack it, it doesn't offer a route to victory. It doesn't offer a way of sustaining the war. What it basically is saying is better a defeat in Ukraine, an outright, clear-cut, straightforward defeat, than a compromise with the Russians, a compromise with Vladimir Putin, with Lucifer himself, in effect, Lucifer's representative on earth, and as Putin is almost described nowadays, and one where, of course, as Reznikov does in his article for The Guardian, invocations of 1938 and the Munich Agreement of that year are, of course, trotted out once more. So, I suspect that over the next few weeks and months, difficult arguments and recriminations will take place. If there's a further Russian offensive, an offensive to grind the Ukrainians down, as I said, it's likely that calls for negotiations will grow, but there will undoubtedly be a pushback. There will be warnings of betrayal of Ukraine and of the West's value system, warnings that the entire rules-based order is in jeopardy, and it's far from clear to me how things will go. Anyway, just wanted to say all of that today. Now, what else is going on in the world? Because it's not just about Ukraine. Now, in a recent program, I discussed at some length the developing relationship between Russia and North Korea. And I mentioned this article by Ray McGovern on this topic about the fact that there was some reason to think that Russia was providing technical and industrial support to North Korea to assist it in its nuclear weapons program. And that article, in turn, was based on an analysis of the latest Hwasong 18 solid fuel intercontinental ballistic missile, which North Korea has unveiled, and which Theodore Postol, a rocket scientist, says looks identical to Russia's Topol-M. Anyway, we've had some interesting developments since that Ray McGovern piece. And firstly, the Russians have made defiant statements about their relations with North Korea. Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, made these comments over the course of a press conference yesterday. He said, "We have our own relations with Pyongyang. We value these relations as North Korea is our neighbor, and we will, of course, continue to develop relations with North Korea, regardless of the opinion of other countries." And the TASS dispatch that contains these comments of Peskov says that Peskov made them in response to recent allegations by Jake Sullivan, President Biden's national security advisor, that the Russians and the North Koreans are pressing forward with a deal whereby North Korea supplies shells to Russia for Russia to continue to conduct the conflict in Ukraine. Now, Peskov had an opportunity yesterday when he made those comments to deny straightforwardly all claims about Russian-North Korean military cooperation. He could have also said, for example, that claims by Theodore Postol, which have received quite a lot of attention, that Russia is assisting North Korea in its nuclear weapons program. He could have said that these were completely untrue and had no basis in fact. Instead, he's come out with this remarkably defiant comment: "We value our relations with North Korea as our neighbor, and we will, of course, continue to develop relations with North Korea, regardless of the opinion of other countries." It's a pretty defiant statement. Now, it is not an admission that Russia is helping North Korea develop nuclear weapons. And I want to stress again that it is still conjecture, pure conjecture, that Russia is providing that level of assistance. And perhaps, in fact, it is not. But certainly it does seem as if Russia and North Korea are coming closer, and it does look as if the Russians are now seriously considering, at the very least, developing economic relations with North Korea as well. And a further announcement that came out of Russia yesterday is to the effect that Russia is now upgrading its embassy in Pyongyang. Apparently, it's only about 18 people staffing that embassy up to now. Apparently, the embassy is going to be strengthened. There's going to be a rotation of staff, and many more officials and diplomats, Russian diplomats, are going to be appointed to the embassy in Pyongyang, which suggests that the Russians are indeed intent on developing their relationship with North Korea. In the meantime, the North Koreans have been taking their own actions, and they've been pretty spectacular, which is that Kim Jong-un has now attended a ceremony at which a nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine, North Korean ballistic missile submarine, was launched. And we've seen photos of this submarine, which, well, I'm sure it's nothing like as big or as sophisticated as the nuclear-powered submarines of the established nuclear powers of China, Russia, the United States, Britain and France, but it looks far bigger than any other submarine that North Korea has operated up to this point. Apparently it is nuclear powered. Apparently it can launch ballistic missiles. Perhaps these do not have a full intercontinental range. Nobody seems to know. And the configuration of this submarine suggests at least an attempt to make it quieter, stealthier than other North Korean submarines. This does look, on the face of it, like a huge leap in capability. Now, North Korea itself should not be underestimated. I've discussed this many times. It does have a significant scientific and industrial base, but in the light of the claims that people like Postol is making, one must ask and wonder whether perhaps North Korea has had some external assistance in developing this submarine, and whether possibly that assistance might have come from Russia, which is possibly, arguably, the world leader alongside the United States in nuclear submarine technology. I don't know. I don't think anybody does. These are questions no one can answer, but they do show the extent to which North Korea continues to evolve as a kind of pocket superpower. It seems to be working towards creating its own mini strategic triad with land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, sea-based submarine-launched intercontinental ballistic missiles operated from nuclear submarines, which presumably have an unlimited range. And, well, who knows, maybe in time the North Koreans will surprise us by doing something in the air as well. And, of course, North Korea is trying to get some kind of satellite array together, and perhaps in time it will. It does have the launchers now to achieve that. Though again, one must ask, does it really have the technological capabilities and the resources? Even if the North Koreans are not doing all of this with the help of the Russians, and as I said, I've no way of knowing myself whether they do or not, the fact that North Korea and Russia are developing relations, and the way that they clearly are, ought to be sending alarm bells, ringing alarm bells in the United States. There is no sign that it is. There's no sign that the United States is taking this whole issue seriously. There's no sign of any change of policy towards North Korea. There's no sign of any change of policy towards Russia. There are not even attempts, so far as I can see, to contact the Russians and to find out from them what exactly is going on. I discussed yesterday the sterility of Western policy in terms of Western attempts to get some kind of diplomatic process going in connection with the conflict in Ukraine. We see a similar sterility in terms of the US approach to what looks like a changing balance of power in the northeastern Pacific? Well, that's Russia, North Korea. The United States is now also becoming very alarmed, clearly very alarmed, spooked, I think is not the wrong word, by the discovery of this advanced chip in the Huawei smartphone. And already we see complaints, claims in the United States that the Chinese might somehow have stolen the manufacturing technology in the United States. There's already an investigation apparently going to be launched to try to find out how the Chinese managed it and if it was done as a result of a leak, to hunt down, presumably, whoever was responsible. It's the same kind of reaction that the United States made in the 1950s when, in response to the Soviet developments, Soviet nuclear weapons developments of that era, looking for spies and traitors, looking for proof of technology theft and industrial theft. Of course, there might be some truth to this, but I doubt that there is very much. And the larger story, again, is that the United States clearly can't bring itself to comprehend that in China it has a co-equal industrial and technological rival, and that China is able to match, in terms of technology, anything that the United States does. Well, we're probably going to be hearing an awful lot more about the story before long, and if any unfortunate person does get roped into the investigations, a bit like Robert Oppenheimer, by the way, did back in the 50s over the Soviet nuclear weapons developments, well, I'm sorry for them in advance. Last but not least, before I finish this program, I just wanted to turn briefly back to the situation in West Africa. We've been hearing lots of reports, lots of rumours and stories about an ECOWAS intervention in Niger. Every day passes. I wait to see whether this intervention force is indeed marching into Niger. No sign of it up to now. I'm starting to think that this intervention is never going to happen, that this is a bluff, and that the bluff has been called, and that perhaps the decisive event was the fact that the African Union has spoken out strongly against such an intervention, with some of the ECOWAS states perhaps unwilling to go against the collective view of the African Union. If so, then the threats of intervention in Niger have perhaps had the opposite effect to the ones intended. They probably hardened the position of the Niger authorities, and they've also perhaps made them more rather than less willing to seek security guarantees from China and Russia. But anyway, we'll have to wait and see. But as I said, I'm starting to think that the ECOWAS intervention in Nigeria is turning out to be something of a bluff. And one other important African-related development has just taken place. The Indian, or shall we say Bharat, hosts of the G20 summit meeting have now apparently managed to get all the G20 states, including China and Russia, to agree to the inclusion of the African Union as a member of the G20. And I think this is a potentially bigger development because it gives the African Union an even stronger formal legal reality. It's, I suspect, only a matter of time before we see mounting pressure for institutions, groups of states, groupings of states, organizations that group together states like the African Union, ASEAN, the Arab League, and others to start demanding permanent representation in the Security Council, in the United Nations. And I think that Modi's actions in getting the African Union into the G20 is perhaps the single most consequential move that has come out of the G20 and will probably be the most consequential move from this summit meeting that is about to happen in Delhi. Well, there we go. There are reports from Russia that Turkey is now giving serious thought to an application for BRICS membership. These are Russian reports. They might be a bit of Russian wishful thinking. We'll have to see. But certainly lots of things continue to happen in the world, even as the United States and its allies in Europe continue to be trapped inside the crisis in Ukraine. Well, that's me for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals and Rumble. To remind you again, I'm now in the process of re-engaging with Twitter, with X. I'm going through a course about how to do that, by the way, and there'll be more from me about that soon. And just keep an eye out for it, though I will provide, I should say, notification both on our Locals platform and no doubt in a video when that is actually going to actively start happening. And in the meantime, remember, you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. And you can also go to our shop and buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again for joining me once more, and more from me soon.